Hello, this is the Lord's Legion and welcome to a brand new countdown, and of course this is the long-awaited top 30 personal favourite comic book movies of all time. Now this video is quite possibly the most difficult I've ever had to set up due to the amount of comic book films that have been released over the years, not to mention that it was difficult for me to rank which ones I personally preferred over the other or which ones were more worthy of being on the list. Now no doubt this is going to be a very controversial list because as you can see my taste will be very different compared to yours, and understandably so. And I do need to stress that at least with some of these picks on this list I was forced to do several ties, and you will see them when we get to that, not to mention that it is so close with some of them that they could easily be switched out at any point in time. Like how numbers 22 and 21 could easily switch between the two of them, because it's really that close between the two. And lastly, just so we're clear, I'm not going to be including straight to DVD comic book films because by that point I'm just going to be there all day, although so long as the animated comic book films have been theatrically released, they are all the more qualified into being on this list. So without further ado, let's begin with the countdown. So kicking off the list at number 30, we have The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And I can see that a lot of you are probably going to disagree and say that both Spider-Man 1 and even The Amazing Spider-Man 1 are easily the superior films than The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and at a technical standpoint, I wouldn't even argue with you. But honestly, despite of its many flaws, I really love The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and what it was trying to do. I feel like Andrew Garfield is debatably the best Spider-Man there is. I honestly love Emma Stone and her chemistry with Andrew. Dane DeHaan had a very interesting Harry Osborn, even if his story arc was quite rushed, and I especially enjoyed Jamie Foxx as Electro. Now again, you can criticize this movie all you want, and I wouldn't even argue with half of your arguments, but with what it was trying to do, as well as a lot of the key moments are just spectacular. But regardless of all of that, every time I revisit this movie, I always have fond memories. And while this movie is far from perfect, I do feel like the hatred for The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is way blown out of proportion, and I feel like this one does deserve a second shot. Moving on to number 29, we have Batman 89. A movie in which, while it does lack in a lot of character development as well as story, it all the more makes up for it thanks to its actors as well as the atmosphere. And yes, a lot of people would put this much higher, but upon reflection and looking back on it, I don't think it really holds up as well as people would think. Now there's no doubting that Michael Keaton is a badass Batman, and even Jack Nicholson is a phenomenal Joker, but the thing that does hold them back, for the most part to me at least, is just how we know very little of Batman and Bruce Wayne, but we know far too much of the Joker, which kind of ruins the mystique of the character, and it should really be focused more on Bruce Wayne in general. But even with that being said, I can't deny that it does have a massive impact within the Batman franchise, and the overall aesthetic of Gotham City is a sight to behold. Coming in at number 28, we have Sin City. Now this movie is very unique in my eyes because it's one of those rare few comic book films that generally does feel like a legitimate comic book coming to life. From its flashy black and white aesthetic, to just how it's been split into multiple stories for one singular film. No doubt this is a very different and niche comic book film that most people have grown accustomed by now, but I've always appreciated the gruesome nature of the Sin City movie, and I feel like in many areas Sin City does have an identity of its own that even a lot of the more mature comic book films don't seem to have compared to Sin City. And while the overall narrative does seem to be a bit disjointed because it does have several different stories, I still think it does work to its advantage somewhat. But again, it does create this illusion in that this is a Frank Miller comic book coming to life. So for number 27, we have Shazam. Now I will be honest in that I had a lot more enjoyment out of Aquaman, but in saying that I do feel like Shazam is more worthy of this spot, mainly because it is technically superior compared to Aquaman, not to mention that I feel like Shazam has a lot more to offer in terms of its personality. Now what I think really works about Shazam is how Zachary Levi does really nail the essence of Shazam and how you can actually buy him being a man-child. And also what I think works about this movie is how it is very simple yet effective, in the sense that there is no end of the world arc, nor is it really anything gigantic in scope. It's just a personal story featuring a kid with powers. To me, that is a huge breath of fresh air compared to a lot of comic book films we get nowadays. Moving on to number 26, we have The Avengers. Now in a similar vein to Batman 89, I can't deny the cultural impact that The Avengers have, but at the same time, I don't feel like it aged nearly as well as one would believe. And yet, it's very fun to see the likes of Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, and Hulk, etc. teaming up for the very first time, and it is cool that we do have Loki as the main villain. And while the story is very simple and harmless for the most part, I do feel like the momentum does kind of drag during the middle section. And while there are plenty of character interactions and character developments, I do feel like it does kind of drag when they are in the helicarrier. But again, I can't take away the fact that the Avengers have done so much for the genre as a whole, and it does prove that yes, you can embrace the comic book nature for films, instead of shying away from its original source material. So for number 25, we have Spider-Man 2. Now this one is undoubtedly going to be the most controversial pick on this list, because no doubt the Raimi Knight will say that this is number 1 and that they won't accept it being anything less, and on top of that, many people on this channel would know that I do think that this movie is very overrated. But even with all of that put to one side, Spider-Man 2 is a very well crafted movie in general, because it really does delve into the psyche of Peter Parker and how being Spider-Man affects his life, and of course I can't forget about Alfred Molina as Doc Ock, who is quite possibly the best on-screen villain in the Spider-Man films. But while I do feel like Tobey Maguire is a very wooden and overrated Spider-Man, at least the script does help his case, and that there are plenty of iconic moments that does make the film worthwhile, especially with all of the themes surrounding it. Coming in at number 24, we have the Lego Batman movie. And it is a bit of a weird timeline in that this movie is easily the best Batman movie we've had in the 2010s, which is very well earned, all things considered. Because while this is very jokey and kind-hearted in nature, this is a true love letter for the Batman mythos. And the fact that this movie does treat pretty much every era of Batman with so much respect is such a huge accomplishment in of itself. And yes, this is a very wacky concept for a Lego Batman movie, but again, it does respect the essence of the character, and it is a huge plus in that this is such a gorgeous looking movie and how it does perfectly exploit the nature of the Lego universe. And for number 23, we have Avengers Age of Ultron. Now, a lot of people do prefer the first one over this, but truth be told, I feel like this is a much superior film for a multitude of reasons. First of all, we do have James Spader as Ultron, and while yes, his character is very different compared to the comics, I do feel like works wonderfully within the confines of the MCU. And even with his very limited time within the series, I do feel like he is easily one of the best villains thus far. Plus, I feel like this movie does focus the most on the Avengers being an actual team, and it does delve deeper into certain characters and how they can often clash with one another. That's not to say that it is without any flaws, because let's be fair, it does have quite a lot to unpack, but truthfully I do feel like Age of Ultron is one of the most underappreciated MCU films out there. Coming in at number 22, we have Dredd. It honestly sucks that we didn't have yet another one from Dredd, because honestly this is such a huge breath of fresh air, and it does remind me so much of some of the best early 2000s comic book films. I especially enjoy how ruthless and brutal Carl Urban can be as Judge Dredd, which is such a huge staple for the character and the world he lives in. Speaking of world, the apocalyptic setting known as Mega City 1 is depressingly dark. And for a very low budget comic book film, I do feel like Dredd has some gorgeous special effects that are just both dark yet also pleasing to the eye in a weird sense. And in many ways, I do feel like Dredd is a much more defined version of Blade. Speaking of Blade, number 21 we have Blade. And yeah, it might be a bit of a contradiction given that I just said that Dredd is more of a redefined version of Blade, however I do have a lot more fond memories with Blade. And after rewatching this movie recently, I can't help but feel that this has aged a lot better than what one would imagine. Moving the shaky CG to one side, that is. And with an actor like Wesley Snipes, I do feel like he does bring plenty of nuance with Blade, and how yes, he is a badass, but there is still a sense of vulnerability to the character as well, which is thanks to the writing as well as his acting chops. Plus, I do have to admire the brutality and gore of this movie, and admittedly, I am a huge sucker when it comes down to the supernatural and vampires. So for number 20, we have Guardians of the Galaxy. Easily one of the most bombastic within the MCU catalogue, as well as being debatably one of its biggest risks, and as you could imagine, it more than paid off. Because Guardians of the Galaxy focuses on outcasts in which we'd probably hate if not for the fact that they were well written and realised. And I feel like this movie wouldn't work nearly as well if not for the characters, because the whole cast themselves do share such wonderful chemistry with one another, and on top of that I do really enjoy the overall aesthetic of space, and it's just an overall gorgeous looking movie. Now, as much as I hate using that certain word to describe movies, Guardians of the Galaxy is genuinely a fun movie. And for number 19, we have The Crow. Yet another comic book film that is very old, yet aged like fine gold. Shitty saying aside, The Crow is such a spectacular movie from not only a visual standpoint, but also the story as well. It's simple, brutal, straight to the point, and just all around violent. Now, as you can imagine, with Blade, I am a huge sucker when it comes down to the gothic aesthetic for movies, so as you could imagine, the goth is a match made in heaven for me. And the late Brendan Lee was such an incredible badass as The Crow, and a lot of the action scenes were wonderfully done. And over the years, I do feel like The Crow has aged very strongly even with the gothic setting. Coming in at number 18, we have Iron Man. A comic book film that is very influential on a multitude of reasons. From kickstarting the Marvel Cinematic Universe to giving us Robert Downey Jr. as the definitive Tony Stark. And similarly with the Avengers before it, Iron Man proves to the mainstream audience in that you can fully embrace the core essence of the source material. And I feel like Iron Man was ahead of its time because it did star an unlikable protagonist who does eventually learn to grow up into becoming a better man, and he does have a very different development compared to most other superheroes that we were known previously. Add that with some nice special effects that still hold up, as well as some pretty stellar set pieces, Iron Man still holds up even to this very day. Moving on to number 17, we have Captain America: The Winter Soldier. A movie that not only surprised me in a bunch of ways, but also turned the MCU upside down. In that there are plenty of twists and turns surrounding this movie that does keep you guessing, and then by the time we get to that big massive revelation, it does feel like a genuine surprise. And as someone who didn't really care much about Captain America in the first film prior to this, I was honestly blown away at how awesome they've made this character and how they further delved into him being a fish out of water. Not to mention that his relationship with Black Widow, Falcon, and even the Winter Soldier are some of the personal highlights in this movie, and how it also pushes the character and his ideologies to the limit, and just also proving us why Captain America is one of the best heroes in the Marvel Universe. Coming in at number 16, we have Watchmen, a graphic novel in which most people deem to be impossible to adapt, but even with some of its major changes, I do feel like that this is a pretty successful adaptation regardless. And like with any good adaptation, even with some of the changes that this movie has made, it still keeps the core essence and ideas of the Watchmen graphic novel. From its interesting concepts to its gritty aesthetics, and even the core characters do remain true to themselves. And while many people are very split in the middle between both this and the original graphic novel, I do appreciate the hell out of this movie and what it tried to accomplish, which for the most part I feel like it succeeds. Moving on to number 15, we have X-Men First Class. And out of all of the core X-Men movies, I always felt like X-Men First Class was the best at nailing the essence of the team. Because instead of primarily focusing on one or two characters, it does focus on the overall team. From exploring the relationship between Charles and Xavier before they became enemies, to seeing the upbringing of Mystique, and even some character development with the likes of Beast, Emma Frost, and even some of the lesser mutants do get their chance to shine. Like I said, I always felt like this was the best X-Men movie, not just because of the team aspect, but it also feels unique and separate from the Bryan Singer era. And it just had its own identity that made it stand out above the rest of the X-Men movies that came before and even after, I'd say. Coming in at number 14, we have Iron Man 3. Yet another controversial choice considering I have this above Iron Man 1, and truth be told, I honestly feel like Iron Man 3 is the most underrated MCU film out there. Because while Iron Man 1 builds up the man behind the Iron Mask, it is Iron Man 3 that does dismantle him piece by piece, and it does make us question on what makes Iron Man. Is it the suit or the man? Which is a wonderful story arc for Tony Stark to follow, because for the longest time people made the assumption that without a suit he is less than nothing. Fortunately, many people disregard this movie mainly because of the Mandarin twist, which is easily the best thing that has ever happened to the Mandarin, because he's always been a shit villain in the comics to begin with. And after all these years, I feel like everyone should give this one another shot, because truthfully, I feel like this is one of the best in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And for number 13, we have Batman Begins. A masterful reinvention of the character in that does take a lot of elements from Batman Year 1 and makes it its own. In a way, I do feel like Batman Begins is the least appreciated in the trilogy, which is pretty unfair because this is the one that started it all, and on top of that it does so much right with the character. And it does explore Bruce Wayne's origin in such a way that most other adaptations haven't really done nearly as well. And even despite of its more grounded take on Gotham City, it still did feel like the identity was there, which sort of got lost in translation within the next two sequels. And to me, Batman Begins is such a prime example of making a dark and gritty movie and yet still maintaining the core essence of the character and its source material. Coming in at number 12, we have Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Now initially I was somewhat skeptical about this one because it was going to be both an origin of Miles Morales as well as exploring the Spider-Verse. But in the surprising turn of events, this came out a lot better than I expected. As a matter of fact, I do feel like this is such a breathtaking movie for a multitude of reasons. And it is easy to see why many do deem this to be the definitive Spider-Man film, because it doesn't focus on just Miles Morales or Peter Parker, but it explores the whole ideology of Spider-Man and that essentially anyone can be Spider-Man. And just like the Lego Batman movie, Into the Spider-Verse is such a huge love letter to the Spider-Man mythos, as well as just being an all-around gorgeous movie in general. For the first tiebreaker of this list, number 11, we have Deadpool 1 and 2. Both movies are drastically different from one another, yet equally as amazing. Deadpool 1 is great for exploring the origin of Wade Wilson, while Deadpool 2 does further explore and even evolve Wade Wilson to such an extent. Now like I said, both films are very different from one another in that Deadpool 1 is more grounded in its direction, while Deadpool 2 is bombastic and over the top. But underneath all of the jokes and fourth wall breaks, there are plenty of nuance that does make both films very interesting in my eyes. And of course, which one is better can be up for debate because they are very different movies from one another, but ultimately I do feel like both films do Wade Wilson justice. And starting off with our top 10, we do have Kick-Ass, a comic book film that actually predates Deadpool in terms of being an R-rated self-aware superhero film. And why I have this above both Deadpool movies is because I just enjoyed the overall colourful aesthetic that does make it resemble more of a comic book film, and on top of that I do feel like there's a really good balance that this movie has that most comic book films seem to lack. And while Kick-Ass is sort of a parody of comic book films and breaks the mold to some extent, at the same time the character of Kick-Ass is pretty relatable in the sense that he wants to be a superhero but is just pretty lame. To me, Kick-Ass always stands out in my eyes just because of its overall balance and how it is a good love letter to superhero movies in general, despite of it picking fun at certain tropes. Coming in at number 9, we have Captain America Civil War. Now this is one of those rare cases in that the adaptation surpasses the original source material in terms of its concept and overall execution. And while yes, we have seen these characters go up against each other during previous movies, it was never to this certain extent. But while Iron Man is somewhat the main antagonist in this entire movie, at the same time you can't understand his motives and he still remains in character as opposed to being a straight up villain. And the overall movie does push both Captain America and Iron Man to their breaking point. And it's also very interesting on how the other characters like Black Widow, Bucky and even Black Panther react within the narrative and rich fraction they reside in. And when all was said and done, Captain America Civil War did make a huge impact within the MCU, in which none other before it could even do. So for number 8 we have Batman Mask of the Phantasm. Truly a masterful extended episode of Batman the Animated Series, with a clear improvement with the animation as well as its amazing soundtrack. And it is easy to see why people would deem this as the definitive Batman movie because it truly respects the character and it does explore his mentality, as well as showing us some glimpses of his origin and even humanizes him to a certain extent. I mentioned that this movie is much darker than the animated series, as well as the wonderful inclusions of both the Phantasm and the Joker added to the mix. And it is pretty easy to see why Warner Brothers wanted to release this in theatres, because it's such a wonderfully crafted story and I feel like it is among the best Batman movies ever made. So for number 7 we have V for Vendetta. Now in a similar fashion to the Watchmen, V for Vendetta, while having plenty of differences compared to the original graphic novel, still maintains the core essence and clearly respects the original source material. But why I think V for Vendetta succeeds over Watchmen is because I do feel like the story is all the more interesting and I feel like the film feels all the more polished in terms of its structure. Not to mention that V is such a compelling character who is portrayed wonderfully by Hugo Weaving, and he does have wonderful chemistry with Natalie Portman's Evie. Like I said, the story is very interesting and I especially love the overall message that this movie gives. But even though this movie is about 14 years old, I always enjoy revisiting V for Vendetta and I always have a blast watching the film. Moving on to number 6, we have another tiebreaker, this time being Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. Now again, both are very drastically different movies, but nevertheless when combined completes an overall narrative. To me, both movies are very ambitious in nature in the sense that Infinity War focuses primarily on Thanos, while Endgame is the conclusion to the overall Marvel Cinematic Universe. But surprisingly enough, even with everything going for both of these movies, they both surpassed our expectations. And the fact that both Avengers Infinity War as well as Endgame could do such feats is just astounding in itself. But regardless of which film you prefer over the other between Infinity War and Endgame, you can't deny that they have done so much for the comic book genre. Coming in at number 5, we have Hellboy 1 and 2. Yes, this is the final tiebreaker on this list, I promise. Now why I love both movies so much is just how unique the world is, with the overall darker aesthetic compared to most other comic book films as well as the creature designs. To me, Ron Perlman will always be the definitive Hellboy regardless of the failed abortion that is the Hellboy reboot. And even to this very day, the effects as well as the overall films in general still hold up pretty strongly, which I do believe stems from the creativity of Del Toro and how he envisions this universe. I could honestly gush about these movies for hours on end, and to this very day I am still craving for that definitive finale, which is Hellboy 3. Moving on to number 4, we have Joker. I've never had a chance to review this movie beforehand, but as you can see by having this placed so highly, it is a clear indicator in that I do love Joker. But honestly, what is there to say that hasn't been said already, aside from that I want more character studies within the comic book genre and that I just want more villain movies in general. And I especially want more comic book films that do take massive risks and play around with such crazy concepts like a Joker origin set within the 80s and making him more sympathetic and just winging it. But while Joaquin Phoenix's Joker is more of a sympathetic take, he still maintains as one of the best Jokers we've ever had on screen. And while I'm somewhat reluctant in having a Joker sequel, I would be perfectly okay in revisiting this universe with various spin-offs with other Batman villains, and that we could eventually see Joaquin Phoenix interact with other characters. Making its way to number 3, we have Black Panther. I have sung my praises for this movie countless times at this point, but honestly, I just think this movie is fantastic on just about every level. I love Chadwick Boseman as T'Challa, I love Michael B. Jordan as Killmonger, I love the setting of Wakanda, and I love just about everything else about this movie when it comes down to action, the costumes, the storyline, what have you. Aside from the shaky CG in the climax, of course. Black Panther to me is single-handedly the greatest MCU film ever made thus far, because I feel like it does have the best protagonist in the form of T'Challa, and that it does have an identity of its own. And for all of these reasons and so much more, I cannot wait for the sequel for Black Panther, because I feel like we're gonna have something really special. Coming in at number 2, we have Logan. A very different conclusion than that of Endgame, but a very fitting one for Wolverine regardless. Hugh Jackman had gave us his performance of his career as Wolverine, and we also got to see the most interesting incarnation of Charles Xavier portrayed wonderfully by Patrick Stewart. And for the similar reason on why I love Joker so much, Logan is a very character-driven movie. We don't get to see many of the core X-Men, nor do we have any massive or bombastic set pieces. But rather than being massive in scale, Logan decided to take a different approach by being more character-driven and being small scale, to which truly worked to this film's advantage. And to me, this should have been the definitive ending for the X-Men film franchise, rather than them continuing with the likes of Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix and ugh. And finally, for number 1, we have The Dark Knight. Admittedly a very predictable choice, but really was there any doubt? Not only do I think that this is the best comic book film ever made, but also quite possibly my favourite film of all time. This movie further deconstructs Batman as a character. We were also given quite possibly the best version of the Joker ever, thanks to Heath Ledger, and pretty much every scene in this movie is iconic in some way, shape or form. And with a wonderful story as well as some fantastic set pieces, The Dark Knight is a cut above the rest. And to me, The Dark Knight has always been a favourite of mine for a personal reason, in that it actually got me into filmmaking, which got me inspired into watching other movies outside of the genre and even looking at behind the scenes stuff and how the films get made. And for all these reasons above, this is why The Dark Knight is my personal favourite comic book film of all time. So what are your personal favourite comic book films, and do you remotely agree with my list? Comment below and share some thoughts. And as always, thank you guys for watching this video. Please like and subscribe. Take care and have a good one.